All right, so we're going to talk about Aristotle's on interpretation. Give me a moment. So, there we go. We're going to see here that Aristotle's on interpretation explains how spoken and written signs express thought and how thoughts become true or false propositions through affirmation and denial. So, in a very real sense, on interpretation is a work about how words become propositions. Let's say prepositions. Propositions. So in the categories, Aristotle classified the kinds of things that can be said, and in On Interpretation, he explains how saying becomes judging. So the categories, we have what can be said, and on interpretation, how saying things how sayings become true or false. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the first major point in this lecture. The place of on interpretation in Aristotle's logic. So it belongs to Aristotle's logical writings. It follows naturally after the categories, because, as I was getting at, the categories dealt with simple terms such as substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, action, and affection. On interpretation now asks how the terms are combined into statements. So Aristotle is moving from classification to judgment. We have a move from term to sentence to proposition. And only propositions can be true or false. So logic begins when meaningful words become truth-bearing statements. The second point, words, thoughts, and things Aristotle opens with a famous account of how language signifies reality. You have that the written words symbolize the spoken words. Spoken words symbolize mental experience. Or mental experiences. And the mental experiences are images of things. Or just, yeah, so it's a symbolic representation of the thing itself in a way, but it's an image, so. And there's an important distinction here, so different people may use different writing systems and different speech sounds, but Aristotle says that the mental experiences signified by speech are the same for all, as are the things of which these experiences are images. So, I should say symbol of. Move here. It's a symbol of. Here. Image. Right, so like I was saying, different writing systems and speech, well, speech sounds, but Aristotle says mental experiences, whoops, signified by speech. And things of which these experiences are images, are the same for all. So on this point, language is conventional, but it is not arbitrary in the deepest sense. Speech points to thought, thought points to reality. Or to put it more shortly, more succinctly, language signifies thought. Thought represents things. Writing from speech, speech from thought, thought from being. Okay, with that I move on to the next point. isolated terms are not true or false. So Aristotle insists that isolated thoughts or isolated experience are not yet true or false. So, for example, man or white, these words signify something that they do not yet affirm or deny anything. Even a strange expression such as goat stag, goat stag, has significance, but is not true or false unless something is added, such as is or is not. So, truth and falsity require combination and separation. So man, not true or false. Man is white. True or false. Man is not white. True or false. So, truth and falsity arise only when something is affirmed or denied. So Aristotle next goes on to talk about nouns. So a noun is a significant sound by convention without reference to time, and no part of it is significant separately from the whole. So in his approximation, a noun is equivalent to something which is significant by convention without time. So examples being man, horse, health, right? So let's look into what is meant more by convention. So Aristotle says that nothing is a noun by nature. A sound becomes a noun when it functions as a symbol by convention. So this means that words signify because a linguistic community uses them that way. So, talks about noun types, so simple and composite nouns. So something like pirate boat, right? That's composite. Its parts contribute to the meaning of the whole, but the part does not necessarily function independently in the same way. And there are indefinite nouns. So Aristotle treats expressions such as not -man, not man, as indefinite nouns. They're not ordinary nouns, but they still denote something in an indefinite way. On to the next point. Verbs. A verb is significant like a noun, but it also carries time. So, in a sense, verb equals significant by convention. With time. A verb is also a sign of something said of something else. Health, it's a noun, is healthy. Verb. Now the difference is that is healthy indicates the present existence of the state in question. A verb introduces time and predication. It allows us to say that something belongs to something or that something does not belong to something. So, takeaway on this point is the verb makes predication temporal. Then finally, on to the next point, sentences. So a sentence is a significant portion of speech, but not every sentence is a proposition. A sentence, in this sense, is just a collection of meaningful speech. Has meaning, may not be true or false. Example, may Socrates recover? It's meaningful, but it's not true or false. So Aristotle is not studying every kind of meaningful speech. He's interested in the kind of speech that can bear truth and falsity, though, which leads us to our next point, which is propositions. Proposition is a sentence that is either true or false. So in this sense, proposition is equivalent to saying meaningful speech that is true or false. Examples. Whoops. Being Socrates is healthy, or Socrates is not healthy. These are propositions because they affirm or deny something. And these break into types as well: simple and composite propositions. A simple proposition asserts or denies one thing. One thing of a thing. One thing of one thing. Composite proposition is made up of simple propositions. So we have this little formulation in which a sentence is proposition is a subset of sentence. All propositions are sentences, but not all sentences are propositions. So we'll move on to the next point. Affirmation and denial. So beyond just the numerical way of determining the types of proposition, Aristotle defines the two basic forms of proposition to be either affirmation or denial. In the case of affirmation, right, it's always a positive assertion. Positive assertion of something about something. Socrates is white, for instance. And then denial, a negative assertion of something about something. Socrates is not white. So affirmation and denial are fundamental operations of truth-bearing speech. Proposition either affirms or denies, as we were talking about before. Let's move on to this next point, which is contradiction. So every affirmation has an opposite denial, and every denial has an opposite affirmation. The pair of propositions is contradictory when the same predicate is affirmed and denied of the same subject. So, for example, if you said both Socrates is white, and you also said Socrates is not white, these are contradictories. So, an important condition exists that the subject and predicate must be the same, and they must be used equivocally. So, contradiction requires the same subject and the same predicate. Teaching point here would be contradiction is not merely disagreement, it is a precise logical opposition. So let's move on to the next point here. Universal and individual subjects. So Aristotle distinguishes between universal and individual subjects. So universal is something that can be predicated of many subjects so like man or animal. Individual something that is not predicated of many subjects. So just individual instances. So in this case, Callias is one thing, or Socrates, or if you're trying to go the animal route, I guess Shamu would be one, right? So, yes, main takeaway here being that universal predicable of many. I guess Socrates also works for that. Individual, not predicable. So yeah, you can see just this reoccurring pattern. Aristotle is very, very careful in the way that he's building up his whole system of thought here. And if only it's because of, well, if you look at all Plato's dialogues, it's a whole thing in order to address, it's like a whole thing in order to address the sophists and their nonsense. And so it's like Aristotle is in a lot of ways especially at the beginning, he's Plato codified in a way. So for those of you that know chess, it's like, well, the history of chess. There's Paul Morphy, and he's able to just do a whole bunch of things intuitively. Doesn't really comment on it too much, though he does comment on it. And then there's the first official world champion, which is Steinitz, and he is said to codify everything, put it in writing, and make it like actual principles and stuff like that. Not to say that, you know, Plato didn't have principles or Paul Morphy didn't have principles, right? But you get my point. It's like this whole thing is codified to where it's like you see a sophistical argument, you can immediately go to the system that Aristotle is setting up and going, the system of thought, and going, oh, okay, it can't be, and then we're not going to have this whole long-winded argument for why, and we're not going to write tons of dialogues each and every single time. I'm just going to show you how you're wrong within the rule set. At least that's the way I see it. Now, on to this next point. Universal, particular, contrary, and contradictory propositions. So Aristotle distinguishes between several forms of proposition now, where he goes and discusses the notion of universal affirmation. So, for example, every man is white would be one. That's a universal affirmation. And then universal denial would be no man. Oh, just the test sirens you might hear in the background. So no man is white. Particular affirmation. So some men are white. Particular denial. Either you could go, not every man is white, or some men are not white. And for contraries, contrary propositions cannot be both true, but they may be both. They may both be false. So every man is white. No man is white. These cannot both be true. But they can both be false. Right, so since some men may be white and some men may not be white. So contraries cannot both be true but may both be false. Contradictories so contradictory propositions cannot both be true and cannot both be false. So for example, every man is white and not every man is white. So one must be true and the other false. Contradictories cannot be both true and cannot both be false, right? So let's take a look at all of this in one example here. So for an original proposition, oops, this is just about out. For an original proposition, say we have every student is prepared. And then for the contradictory, not every student is prepared. And for the contrary, no student is prepared. Right, so the sentence "not every student is prepared" does not mean the same thing as "no student is prepared," right? So not every is not equal to none in this case. Well, yeah, no, and that's just how it is. Okay. Gonna have to get spray or a better eraser for this. Okay. Let's move on to the next point. Single and compound. Single and compound propositions. So it's like we were saying with the simple and compound position earlier, just using single here. So in this case, well, from along this this text, Aristotle is careful about what makes a proposition genuinely one. So that's why we're going back and we're talking about this. It's an affirmation or denial is single if it indicates one fact about one subject. So an example of a single proposition is Socrates is white. So the problem case here, well, there's a problem case. So some propositions look single, but are really compound. So for example, if a word had two unrelated meanings, a proposition using that word might not express one unified assertion. So the proposition is not made one merely by written as one sentence. It is only one only if it signifies one fact. So grammatical unity is not always logical unity. On to the next point, future contingents, as in plural of contingent. So chapter 9 of this contains one of the most famous arguments in Aristotle's logical works, and it's on the issue of whether statements about the future are already determinedly true or false. So past, well, it's going to be a bit present and past propositions. Statements about what is or what has already happened must be either true or false. For example, Socrates is sitting, or Socrates sat yesterday. And there's future propositions. So statements about future contingent events are different. So for example, there will be a sea fight tomorrow. Or there will not be, and there will not. There will whoops, forgot the not, the essential part, otherwise you're writing the sentence the exact same. There will not be a sea fight tomorrow. Aristotle says that a sea fight must either happen tomorrow or not happen tomorrow, but it is not necessary that it happen, and it is not necessary that it fail to happen. So, either it will happen, or it will not happen. But not it is already necessary which one will happen. Oops. Sorry. So why does that matter? Let me just write back the point that we're talking about here. Up here. So, if every future tense proposition were already determinedly true or false in the same way as present in past propositions, then everything would seem to happen by necessity. So, that's a point to really... And that would threaten things like deliberation, action, chance, contingency, responsibility. Right, so Aristotle preserves contingency by distinguishing between logical alternatives and necessary outcomes. So the future is open where there is real potentiality in contrary directions. Oh, jeez. My eraser's falling apart over here. That's not good. I might have another one though, so. On to the next point. Modal propositions. So the later chapters examine propositions involving possibility, impossibility, contingency, and necessity. So they deal with what's possible, impossible, contingent, necessary, or necessary. Necessary. Some basic modal distinctions. And there's this thing called modal logic, which I bet gets its name from this. So, basic modal distinctions. It may be, it's not equal to it must be. It may not be is not the same as it cannot be. And so Aristotle is especially concerned with finding the correct contradictions of modal propositions. And for this, the placement of negation is important. So, for example, it maybe is not for example, the contradiction, well, the contradictory, it may be is not, it may not be, because the same thing may both be possible and possible not to be. The proper contradictory is it cannot be. Modal logic requires special care about where the negation belongs. Changing the place of not changes the logic of the proposition. On to the next point. Possibility and necessity. So Aristotle distinguishes kinds of possibility. Something may be possible because it is already actual. A walking man can walk because he is walking. Something else may be possible because it could be actual under the right conditions. A seated man can walk because he has the capacity to walk, right? So let me just possible because already actual. Possible because could be under the right conditions. A seated man can walk because he has the capacity to walk. In this case, yes. Right. So possibility can mean actuality or capacity in this sense. So Aristotle is careful not to treat every use of possible as identical. So possible is said in more than one way here. Can mean actuality or capacity. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Next point. The contrary of an affirmation So the final chapter asks whether the contrary of an affirmation is another affirmation or denial. So, for example, what is contrary of every man? Well, let's capitalize that. Every man is just. Is it no man is just? Or every man is unjust? So this final chapter returns to the question of logical opposition. Aristotle wants to distinguish carefully between contradiction, contrariety, affirmation, denial, contrary predicates. So logical opposition itself has structure. moving on to the next point here. So let's talk about this pattern that pops up here. So Aristotle's method and on interpretation. So throughout the treatise, Aristotle follows a steady method. He defines something, distinguishes, and tests oppositions. He defines basic terms here like noun, verb, sentence, proposition, right? So to the define part, then distinguish different types of propositions, affirmation, denial, contrary. Oh yeah, and by the way, back to that other one. They both work, but he's just talking about like which sort of one would you use in the proper context, I guess. But anyhow, affirmation, denial, contrary, contradictory. This is the distinguishing part of the thing, right? So it's just saying start 1, start 2, start 3. And then he tests difficult cases, opposition, so future contingents, modal propositions, contrary affirmations. Right, so yes. So to move on to the final big point here. On interpretation is Aristotle's bridge from language to logic. It explains how meaningful words become truth-bearing propositions and how propositions stand in relations of affirmation, denial, contradiction, contrariety, possibility, and necessity. So, like we were discussing earlier on interpretation, is Aristotle's theory of truth-bearing speech. So let's go back to the four main ideas. Well, let's sort of reiterate what we discussed here. So words signify thoughts, and thoughts represent things. Isolated terms are meaningful, but not true or false. Truth and falsity arise through affirmation and denial. Contradiction, contrariety, possibility, and necessity must be carefully distinguished. And in the categories, Aristotle classified what can be said, and on interpretation, he explains how what is said can be true or false. Well, how what is said becomes true or false. All right, so that is it for this lecture. On to the next one.